Hey, world history students, welcome to our lecture on Alexander the Great. 323 BC is a key year. We'll talk about that why. So have your outlines ready and take some notes on our 3 points and our so what. Let's dive right in. Okay, so who was Alexander? What was some of his background? How did he rise to power? Well, he was actually a Macedonian. Macedonia is actually a region north of Greece. You can look; they've actually become a separate nation from Greece today. And so, while they were Greek, they were kind of part of that Greek culture because of the gods that they worshipped and also the language that they spoke. They're also a little bit of an outsider outside of the normal Greek city states. He was the son of Philip II and uh, his mother Olympias. His mother was Greek, however, Philip was Macedonian, so he was kind of in between. Even though, again, they were all Greek, he was kind of known as a half breed. With mixed parents, and for that reason, he wasn't sure if he would ever be able to ascend to the throne after his father. Um, in fact, anyway, his relationship for his father wasn't very good. We'll just leave it at that. And he was tutored because he's son of a very powerful family. He was tutored by none other than the famous Aristotle, the student of Plato and the grand student of Socrates. This is a statue of his father, Philip II, who's often depicted as missing an eye that he lost in battle. Why? Because Philip was known as the uniter, or to some, the conqueror and oppressor of Greece. He established this thing called the Corinthian League, which was a union of Greek city states that sought to unite all of Greece, not as separate fighting and inter-conflicting city states, like had been much the case the previous century, like when we talked about the Persian Wars, where they're just united by their culture, but they weren't really one nation. Philip sought to actually create a Greek nation, and he succeeds, and he conquers the Greek city states, and becomes their ruler. And some saw him again as an empire builder. The Greek city states tended to see him as a ruthless conqueror. His son Alexander serves in the army that suppresses Greek rebellion and kind of earns a reputation as being brilliant and a magnificent military general and tactician. Um, During his rise to power, his father, Philip II, is assassinated. There's lots of conspiracy theories about who actually killed him and whether his wife, Olympias, or Alexander actually participated in it, but that's all speculation. But he is killed, and Alexander uses the death of his father as a moment to seize the throne due to his popularity with the Macedonian army. He then proceeds to consolidate his power with a violent suppression of the Greeks because, with the death of Philip, they think maybe this is our chance to break away from the Corinthian League and go back to being independent city states. However, Alexander famously destroys Thebes as a warning against rebelling, and so he continues to keep that Greek empire united that his father started. However, Alexander is not content with just having a Greek empire. He has his eyes set on the historical rival of Persia. This is several generations after the Persian Wars. However, Persia, being the dominant power to the east in Turkey and then on through Asia, continually is seen as a threat to Greece. And uh, uh, Alexander has grand dreams of taking the fight to the Persians, not just remaining independent and free in Greece, but to going after the Persian Empire. So he famously invades the Persian Empire following his ascension to the throne and engages in a 10-year campaign against the Persian Empire, and faces off their ruler, who is now Darius III. If you remember, Darius I was the Persian king who invaded Greece during the Battle of Marathon. But subsequent ruler Darius III is on the throne at the time of Alexander, and they face off at three battles. The final battle of which is known as the Battle of Gaugamela, at which Darius is completely routed and defeated. In fact, Alexander defeats Darius all three times, but Gaugamela is the final defeat that takes place near the city of out in Iran, and the Persian Empire officially collapses. Alexander crowns himself king of Persia, crowns himself king of Babylon, kind of basically king of all the world, because in their minds that amount of territory represented all the world. It included Egypt, Israel. He conquers Israel, conquers Egypt, Babylon, and also modern day Iran. So it's the largest empire to date. We'll go ahead and take a look at a map in a second. This is a frieze that depicts the famous Battle of Gaugamela, which represents the final fall of the Persian Empire to Alexander the Great and the Greek or Macedonian army. Alexander is there on the left. Darius is up in his chariot, facing off against him. This is a map of Alexander's empire. Again, the largest to date. Again, we remember the Persian Empire expanded from Iran and Afghanistan down into Egypt and Asia Minor. Alexander takes all of that, but also includes, you can see, Greece and Macedonia in the top left of your screen here. All the more impressive, you can see the years if you want to look at this a little more closely. You see Gaugamela taking place on the banks of the Tigris River, right in the middle. After he defeats Darius III there, he continues to press east into Iran, Afghanistan. The last foreign invader, successful foreign invader of Afghanistan actually was Alexander the Great. Many have tried since, and all have failed. And he actually, his expansion takes him all the way to the borders of India, there at the Indus River on the right, where he eventually finally returns, ceases his expansion and returns back to Babylon, which he's going to make the capital of his new empire. Just another look at the map. The way they counted it differently, it says 12 years here, but we can consider his conquest of the Persian Empire is taking only 10 years, but close enough, 10 to 12 years. You can see what he inherited from his father compared to what he's able to do in just about a decade. He's known as the lightning bolt of history because the expansion is just absolutely remarkable. And again, his military, he never lost a battle. He was a brilliant tactician, and actually we'll see even a pretty good governor in terms of how he tried to keep his empire together. Relative size of his empire as compared to the United States, the continental United States, very comparable. And imagine just doing that in not even one lifetime, but again, 10 to 12 years. The end, however, Alexander is also not only a story of how did a human being achieve that, it's a story of what might have been. Because first of all, as I said, he reaches the borders of India. His troops famously decide, I kind of revolt against him and say, you've pushed us. We're a long way from Greece here on the border of India, and they want to go home. And so he takes his men on a trek back to Babylon, allowing many of his soldiers to return home. He knows he needs to reform his army because, again, he's got the guys who have been fighting with him are burnt out, and he needs to kind of recharge. He, however, doesn't mean he's done. He actually sets his sight on the Arabian Peninsula, which if I go back to the map, you can see the Saudi Arabia down to the south. He had his eyes on that territory, but also thought of turning west over to going to the boot of Italy, where Rome and Carthage, there in North Africa. So Alexander had plans of expanding, just not east, but perhaps going west or even south. However, in 323, our key date for this lecture, he dies only at the age of 32. So at a very young age, he dies in Babylon of a fever, many think tied to alcohol poisoning. He was a notorious drinker. Other people may say maybe he was poisoned, but again, there's no strong evidence for that. There is strong evidence for his lack of control when it came to drinking. So he dies tragically very young, where, again, the full extent of his exploits kind of unrealized. And then that massive territory ends up being divided up among his generals and ruled separately by them. Here we have the dividing up of the empire among his 5 or so generals. One takes over, the Ptolemy famously takes over Egypt there in Africa. It'll be a descendant of Ptolemy that is going to be one of the ancestors of Cleopatra, the later famous queen of Egypt. She wasn't Egyptian. She was actually a descendant of the Greek general. Then you can see the kind of the Asia Minor, and then the Far East, and then the 2 Greek kingdoms. And these generals would famously fight for many generations with each other, and their descendants would fight for many generations with each other over who was the rightful heir, and kind of border disputes and things like that. And even much of the prophecy in the book of Daniel depicts the ongoing conflict between Alexander's generals and their later successors. But here we want to look at his impact. So after creating this empire, so what? What's the big deal? And let me move my window here because there's a lot of text being covered up. Let's go back. One of the successes and impacts of Alexander's reign was, again, he took all that territory, but after taking the territory, what did he do? Well, he encouraged cultural fusion or syncretism, bringing things together. And so whenever he would encounter a new culture or a new religion or a new people, he would oftentimes offer sacrifices to foreign gods. He would oftentimes adopt foreign religious titles. He famously, when he took Jerusalem, he went in and wanted to make a sacrifice to Yahweh, to the Jewish gods in the temple that they had rebuilt after their exile. They refused letting him go in, but they made one in his name. He would oftentimes he changed his form of dress to match wherever he was. In particular, he really once he became the king of Persia, he adopted Persian dress. He even, his wife, I think it was Roxanne or Roxana, she was Persian. He encouraged all of his generals to marry foreign women. Um, he wanted to bring the cultures together, and many of his Greek allies kind of took offense at this because they felt like he was forsaking or abandoning or betraying his roots. But Alexander said, "No, I'm not just going to be a Greek king," because again, he wasn't even in a way Greek; he was Macedonian, so he was already had a precedent for this. But he was looking for a way to unite these peoples, not in their own smaller cultural enclaves, but to kind of create the first kind of world or pan national identity. He also many times he left foreign rulers intact. When he conquered them, he didn't say, "Hey, you have to become Greek." He said, "No, you could stay in power. You can maintain your religion. Sacrifice to me. I'll adopt your dress. Let's intermix." And he would include them in his army and his government. So many people, it was kind of a stable, at least it was short-lived, so we don't know the full story, but it was relatively stable because people didn't lose their power or their authority when he came in charge. They simply had to direct it under his rule, but he left them to basically govern their smaller territory as they saw fit. So he considered, in a way, a very tolerant conqueror and kind of easy to swallow, easy to work with. Another key way to impact that this leads to is something we call Hellenization. And this is the ability to spread Greek culture. Another name for the Greek area was the Hellenes, or a Hellenic culture. And so the taking of that Greek culture and spreading it all throughout Asia Minor, Egypt, the Middle East, even some of the Far East, down to India and Afghanistan, that's a process we call Hellenization. That includes the spreading of the Greek language, their values, arete, humanism, rationalism, their beliefs, their literature, stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the writings of Socrates and the teachings of Aristotle, who again was the student of Plato. So all of the things that, the Republic and the things we've been looking at get carried out, not only preserved by Alexander, but spread throughout all over Asia and North Africa. Greek architecture is spread, and also Greek dress. So while he didn't force these things on the nations that he conquered, because he established a good relationship with them, there became this exchange and trade of ideas began to take place. The Greek language becomes the lingua franca. That means the familiar tongue. So in other words, where you would go to these different regions throughout his empire, people would have their kind of their local language, but everyone began to learn Greek so that they could engage in the larger language of power, or the language that allowed you to communicate nation to nation. The example today is English. Currently is the lingua franca that anybody who wishes to do business outside of their borders usually will learn English. This is why Americans are so bad at learning foreign languages, is because we already speak the common or the familiar tongue of the world. Well, Greek, thanks to Alexander, was the first lingua franca. And this is going to be a reason why the New Testament and many of the most famous ancient texts are all translated and preserved in Greek, because that was the one language that, no matter where you were, all the way from Greece to Egypt to Iran and Afghanistan, people would learn to read and write. Also, Greek values, in a way, kind of become watered down. They begin to mix with the ancient Near East. And so they adopt Greek customs, but also the Greek culture begins to be changed itself by those foreign customs or outside customs. And so Hellenic refers to a purely Greek culture that kind of in the time of the Persian Wars and the teaching of Socrates and Plato, and we looked at Thucydides and those sorts. And then when we say Hellenistic, that's referring to kind of the diffused, modified, and spread Greek culture that was adopted throughout Alexander's empire. Okay. One key aspect of this Hellenization was the impact it had on the Jews, because the Jews again came under his control. This is where we finally have the bringing together of our two pillars of Western civilization: Athens meeting Jerusalem. It happened under Alexander and the process of Hellenization that followed. Revelation meeting reason. The frieze above is we think is a depiction of Alexander coming before the high priest, asking to make a sacrifice of that bull to Yahweh, their God, trying to ingratiate himself to the Jews. But an impact was that the Jews and their scriptures, again, ethical monotheism and Revelation, began to apply Greek reason. They got exposure to Socrates, and they got exposure to Plato, and they got exposure to these Greek thinkings and the ideas of humanism, and they began to say, oh, wait, is this different than what we believe, or is this just what we believe, but from a pagan or outsider's perspective? And they began to apply Greek rationality to Scripture and to say, no, this is true. What these guys are saying, these Greek thinkers, it only confirms what we have already known through the Torah and through the Pentateuch and the Jewish scriptures. And we kind of have, again, the coming together of the forefinger and the thumb, the reason and the revelation. The Greek thinkers began to say, no, some saw the teachings of Alexander and the Greeks as a threat, but many thinkers said, no, they're just confirmation. They're just, again, views of the same truth, but from the other perspective. And again, so that's why this moment of Hellenization is kind of key, because it's a bringing together of these two aspects of searching for truth about reality, the ethical revelation from above, and also the humanistic rationality of human beings from below. What you have there, the picture on the right, is just a rendition of the famous library at Alexandria. All throughout this, one way to measure Alexander's influence is if you actually were to look at how many cities. I think he founded something like 32 different cities, all named Alexandria, throughout his empire. It might have been 23, could be getting that number wrong, but a significant number. The most famous of which was it on the river delta at the bottom of the Nile River in Egypt, where he built his famous lighthouse, and where, again, they had a famous library bringing together all the learning of that empire into one place. And so, again, for the kind of the advancement of knowledge and the unification of human civilization, although Alexander's own life was short-lived, his impact was multiple times in magnitude. All right, so what? Alexander's lightning quick conquests and rule. Again, the lightning bolt of history changed the world in just a few years. The world was completely altered after his short life, where you had the Persian Empire, you had the small diminutive Greek Empire, with, again, powerful ideas, interesting ideas, but very much sequestered or isolated within just the little Greek peninsula. Who knows about that? You might have a breakthrough idea, but if you don't tell anybody, it's not going to change the world. So we're kind of the example of the Vikings. They say, oh, the Vikings discovered the New World before Columbus. Well, they didn't tell anybody, and so the impact of it, yes, they did it, but the significance is it didn't have the impact. Alexander, his life had an incredible impact by uniting and spreading the Greek ideas of these tiny city-states. Athens was just this one city-state of a few, tens of thousands of people, and yet now it impacts billions of people across the globe. Alexander's conquest, some would say almost miraculous, divinely ordained conquest, because of his incredible string of victories and his ability to win it so quickly, completely changed the world. Again, the uniting of diverse cultures, this pan-Hellenic world, kind of creates this idea of a citizen of the world. Again, like that's that cultural fusion that Alexander practiced, that not seeing yourself solely as your smaller cultural group, but say, no, we're human beings. What the Greeks discovered as truth, that applies to the Babylonians, that applies to the Egyptians, that applies to the Jews, and kind of seeing each other more as a united humanity. That idea first really gains power under this Hellenic world created by Alexander. Again, take the example of the Greeks. They're the ones where we get the word barbarian. And who were barbarians? Well, they were anybody who didn't speak Greek. They're outsiders. They're the ones who should be slaves. They're the ones who are different. We don't even know if they have the ability to be as rational as the Greeks thought they could be. Whereas Alexander kind of breaks that down and says, no, this truth is our culture, our ways of thinking. This is for the whole world. And lastly, again, the spread of Greek culture, language, and ideas finally brings together the two pillars of modernity, the rationality and reason of Athens, and the ethical monotheism and the revelation of the Jewish people. So we're going to see how those then begin to synthesize and produce, again, the next stage of Western civilization. Alrighty, hope you enjoyed that. We'll be discussing it tomorrow in class. Have a great night, or well, I don't know if it's night yet. Wherever you are, see you soon.